The brain is a remarkably powerful place, the central organ of the human nervous system. It's made up of 100,000 miles of blood vessels. That's almost 4 times larger than the distance around the equator. Neurons transmit and receive information that tells us when to breathe, when something is painful, warns us when there is danger, and tells us when to cheer for the touchdown. Within the brain, there are 100 billion neurons who pass information as fast as 250 miles per hour. That could outpace a Formula One race car. The power of the brain is remarkable. But what if our brains have adopted a mindset that needs an upgrade? Are we in danger of being trapped in our mindsets? How do we stop these mindsets from becoming mind traps?
Have you ever been on a plane when you experience a sudden drop in altitude and the flight attendant's face all of a sudden becomes white? Have you been on an elevator when it just stops, the power goes out, the door won't open? Or maybe you've been in a conversation with someone who just won't stop talking. They go on and on and on and on, and you just can't find the opportunity to break away. None of us like the feeling of being trapped. Our natural response when we feel trapped physically is to escape. And if we can't, oftentimes we panic, we become afraid. But unlike being physically trapped, we aren't always aware of when we're mentally trapped. See, we all have these mindsets, which are they're ways of thinking that impact how we view the world around us. And what we think, particularly what we repeatedly think, it shapes our mindset, which then shapes our feelings. Our minds, they instruct us what to feel based on what we're thinking, based on what's happening around us. These repetitive thought cycles, they can create a mentality that becomes a trap. There's an ancient Greek philosopher, his name is Epictetus, who said this: "We are disturbed not by things, but by the view in which we take of them." See, we think it's the circumstances that are disturbing us, but no, it's our view of them. So how do you know? How do you know when a mindset has become a mind trap? And better yet, what do we do to avoid the trap? So let's get started. In this session, we're going to talk about the victim trap. What does it mean to be caught up in this way of thinking, where you see the world around you through the lens of a victim? Oftentimes, it happens to us without even realizing it. Let me just give you a couple of different scenarios. Maybe you're at work and you learn that the promotion that you really wanted was given to your coworker. Where does your mind go in that moment? Do you evaluate what you could have done differently through the interview process, or what you can do better in the future to put yourself in a better position for advancement? Or do you just naturally think, it's the boss's fault? I mean, she picked her favorites long ago. She's always had it in for me. She had a problem with me from the first day I started here. She's never really liked me, and I probably just need to quit and go find a new job. Or maybe you're at a family gathering. And you're single. And within minutes of arriving, your dad asks if anything's new. Are you up to anything different? Happen to be dating anyone? I mean, where does your mind go? Do you think, you know what? I mean, he probably just wants to know what's going on with my life. Or does your internal dialogue sound like this? Oh, here he goes again. I mean, I haven't even been here 5 minutes and he's already critiquing my life, despite the fact that I actually have a career that I love and that I'm a self-sufficient adult. Nothing I ever do is good enough for him. I mean, we could go on and on and on with examples and illustrations, but the question for each of us is this: where in my life can I fall into the victim trap? Think about the dialogue that you repeat in your mind, the imaginary conversations that you have where you get trapped in feeling like a victim. Let me give you just a simple definition for this type of mindset. A victim mentality is when you blame everyone else for what happens in your world. A victim might say things like, well, I'm always at a disadvantage because of my circumstances. Or everyone is always out to get me. Everybody has had it easier than me. It's always been hard for me. I recognize that strong language like always and never, it can be off-putting. You may be tempted to even push back against it, but let me just say this. Every single one of us has experienced the victim mentality at some point in our lives. And when we do, the internal conversations, they revolve around offenses done to us. And those repeated thoughts, they shape what we feel. I'm sad, I'm miserable, I'm unhappy, I'm depressed, fill in the blank. I mean, we get caught in this continual loop. And let me just pause here to say one thing. I recognize that there are actual victims. I mean, whether it's a crime or an abuse or many other kinds of horrific injustices. When I say victim, I am not referring to injustices occurring outside of your control. No, for our purposes, I want to talk about the things that are done that are within our control, the victim mindset that we get to choose. Yeah, we're talking about the thinking that we tolerate, that causes us to become stuck. So let me just ask you this question. Is a victim mentality good for you? I mean, does it lead you to a life that's full? Is it good for the people around you? I think we all know that the answer to that question is a resounding no. So if we want to avoid a victim mind trap, we have to learn to think differently. Instead of thinking of myself as a victim, which some people are, what would it look like to think of myself as a survivor? Even that simple shift can begin, it can open up a new way. It can open up new thoughts. It can allow us to move past some of the consequences of the victim's trap. So how do we do that? Well, a lot of it begins with the stories that we tell ourselves. But before we talk about us, let me introduce you to a guy who had every right to feel like a victim because life repeatedly didn't go well for him. And yet he chose to avoid the victim mind trap. He told himself different stories. His name was Joseph, and his story is captured in the part of the Bible that we know of as the Old Testament. Now, you may be watching this, and you might have a lot of questions about the Bible. Maybe you have questions in general about faith. No matter how you view yourself from a spiritual standpoint, I believe there's something that all of us can learn, that all of us can take away from Joseph's life. Joseph was the son of a man named Jacob and a lady named Rachel, and he had lots of brothers, and he had at least one sister that we know of. Joseph's dad, his dad loved him. His dad, in fact, loved him more than he loved all of his other sons. And so naturally, his brothers, they hated him because of that. But this wasn't just your average sibling rivalry. No, his brothers wanted to destroy him. So one day they actually sold him into slavery. They told their dad that this wild animal had actually killed Joseph. See, I would say that actually qualifies as a dysfunctional family when you're telling stories of a wild animal killing your sibling, right? Yet Joseph is sent actually to this distant land. He was sold into slavery. He worked as a servant. And over time, Joseph, he worked hard. He was responsible. He was diligent. He was persistent. And so this man named Potiphar, who was his boss, his manager, he noticed that Joseph was a go-getter, that Joseph was a hard worker. And because of that, he gave Joseph more and more responsibility to the point where Joseph was essentially running his entire estate. Sounds like life had turned around for him, right? Well, things took a dramatic turn for Joseph. His boss's wife, she decides that she's kind of into him. She makes a move toward him, but Joseph does the honorable thing, and he rejects her advances, and he runs the other way. But that's not the story that she tells her husband. No, she falsely accuses Joseph of inappropriate advances, and then boom, out of nowhere, Potiphar comes and presses charges essentially and throws him in prison. Yeah, this is the same guy who was sold into slavery by his own family, who had worked his way up, and now he finds himself at the bottom again. But Joseph's story doesn't end there. No, over time, he becomes influential even in prison. People were going to him for advice. Eventually, he actually has this chance to get out. If only a couple of guys who he had advised, if only they would put in a good word for him once they got out. But no. Once they're released, they forgot about Joseph. So he's sold into slavery. He's falsely accused. And now he's forgotten in prison. Can you even imagine all of the feelings and emotions that he could have bumped into? I mean, imagine all the negative energy. Imagine the negative feelings of why could this have happened? Why in the world is this going on? How is this happening again? And yet somehow, through it all, Joseph did not succumb to the victim mindset. And here's why I think he was able to avoid it. He brought God into his story. He chose not to let those negative circumstances keep him from realizing that God had more for him. That even in the middle of it all, that God was doing something great. Yeah, it's amazing how the prison sometimes causes us to question everything. In fact, raise your hand if you've ever been. No, I won't ask you to do that, but I would just love to ask you, have you ever been in a figurative prison? Probably. I mean, we've all locked ourselves up in a way of thinking. We find ourselves in this dark night of the soul where we begin to question the same things. God, why is this happening to me? God, what are you even doing? God, how could this happen again? Joseph had to have been tempted to ask some of these same questions, but yet somehow Joseph seemed to ask this specific question: God, could you be using the circumstances around me to do something in me and to do something through me? Could God be doing something so great that no one else can see to set all of this up? Could he be doing this in such a way that no one else would be able to deny that God was the one doing all of this? I don't know how Joseph had the wherewithal to be able to ask this kind of question, but clearly something or someone was leading Joseph. Someone is guiding Joseph to the point where there is this dramatic scene that happens in Genesis chapter 50. Toward the end of Joseph's life, he actually at this point had gotten out of prison. And Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, had heard that Joseph had this gift to interpret dreams. And Joseph actually interpreted Pharaoh's dream, and he predicted that this famine would hit the area and that the country would need to store up food now so that they could survive later. And so Pharaoh elevated him to the second highest position in the whole country. He had been responsible, he had been faithful, he had been diligent, and now he was number 2 in all of Egypt. So, sometime later on, off in a distant land, Joseph's family was on the other side of the famine. They were on the verge of starvation. The times were tough for them. And so Jacob, remember him, Joseph's father, who thought Joseph was dead, he tells his sons, he says, well, maybe you should go to our neighboring country, Egypt, and beg for help. And so the brothers, they pack up. They make their way over to Egypt, where they have this face-to-face altercation with none other than their long-lost brother. Remember, they don't know that he's in charge of the operations there. And for a moment, Joseph was able to hold it all together and have a conversation with them where they didn't even realize who he was. They didn't know his identity. But then the moment comes where his identity is now revealed. And the brothers realize that they're standing face to face with the very person that they had thrown in the pit. And they're scared, they're afraid, they're fearing for their lives naturally. Joseph had been the victim of their act of jealousy. He had suffered in many ways as a result of their actions, but Joseph didn't seem to see himself as a victim. No, Joseph actually seemed to see himself as a part of a bigger story, one that he couldn't even see the full picture of. But I want you to just listen to the words that Joseph spoke to them. These words offer a glimpse into Joseph's mindset that seemed to allow him to live in such a different way. Genesis says this, that Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid." Am I in the place of God? No, he goes on to say, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. Yeah, Joseph was essentially saying, I'm not your judge. God is. I don't have the ability to look through these circumstances and figure out what God is doing. That's not my job. That's God's job. But maybe that's what Joseph was able to do when he was sold into slavery. Maybe he was able to see with the same perspective. See, when it's possible that everything in him wanted to be the vindicator, he had the ability, the perspective to decide in that moment, I'm not in the place of God now. And then when he was falsely accused by Potiphar's wife, he had to decide then, am I going to take up my own cause? Or will I submit to what's happening around me? Will I submit to the only one who can do anything about this? He had to decide then, am I in the place of God? When he was forgotten about in prison, it would have been so easy for him to just believe the lies that if everyone else has forgotten about me, that maybe God has forgotten about me too. But he knew the character of God, that God is not one to forget. So Joseph had to remind himself yet again, am I in the place of God? He had to repeatedly ask himself, am I in the seat of the Almighty? Through every chapter of his life, through his decision to trust in God, Joseph actually reframed each chapter of his life into an opportunity to trust in God's bigger story. Listen to the way Joseph reframes his story to his brothers, the actual people who sold him into slavery. He says, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Yeah, see, he refused to be ensnared by this victim mind trap. Despite what others had done to him, he chose to trust in the one who was ultimately in control. Joseph couldn't control his circumstances, neither can you, neither can I. But in the middle of it all, he chose to believe that God was with him. He chose to believe that God was writing a new story, a story that he couldn't yet see. He seemed to believe that God could somehow use his life, his circumstances, not just for his own good, but for the good of others around him as well. Look at what Joseph says next. He tells his brothers, he says, don't be afraid. He says that he'll provide for them, that he'll provide for their children. And he reassured them and he spoke kindly to them. I love that line. This is beautiful. I mean, this is huge because this is one of the problems with feeling like a victim is that we feel out of control. But consider this. In every chapter of Joseph's life that we know about, what could Joseph really control? The one thing he could control was his response. Would he respond in retaliation, or would he respond in the way of redemption? Instead of determining what we can't control, maybe the way we get out of the victim trap is to decide what we can and what we can't control. Yeah, you may have had wrong done to you. But what if you choose to believe, okay, that is what it is? Maybe you did it for harm, but God is going to do something good through this. I mean, how would that change things? How would that make things different? What would it look like if we, like Joseph, reframed our own stories, the stories we tell ourselves? Instead of allowing ourselves to become bitter and frustrated and angry, what if we told a different story? What if we were convinced that God really is with us? That the presence of God through the Holy Spirit that lives in us, that as followers of Jesus, that he would lead us and guide us through whatever it is that we may face. What if we chose to look up and say, God, could you be using this to do something in me and to do something through me? See, that doesn't sound like what a victim would say, does it? How do we begin to do that? How do we begin to live that way? I'd love to offer just 3 simple steps that I think all of us can take to begin experiencing freedom from a victim mind trap. Here's the first step. Would you identify your victim thinking? Whether you consider yourself a Jesus follower or even if you don't, would you just choose to identify your victim thinking? The better you get at identifying those thoughts, the better you'll be at identifying them, right? I mean, that seems redundant, but if you never identify them, if you never isolate them, if you never actually get to experience combating them and fighting against them, then you just don't know what it feels like to do that. But once you're on alert, once you start looking for them, once you start seeing them, you start getting better at it. You start seeing them more quickly, and then you can start to actually deal with them before they grow any bigger. This has certainly been true in my own life. For step 2, would you consider any underlying false benefits? Would you be willing to try to get some awareness about the false benefits of your victim thoughts? Now this requires getting really honest with ourselves, maybe even asking yourself this question: do I get any benefits? Is there anything I like about the victim mindset? Maybe this might be odd at first, but it's worth pondering the answer to this question, because I think what we find is that we actually do. There's a part of us that kind of likes it. I mean, think about this. Has your victim mentality allowed you to avoid having to take responsibility for things? Sure it has. Has it given you someone or maybe even something to blame? Probably. I mean, if it's always someone else's fault, then I don't have to take responsibility. Or has it provided an opportunity for you to gain the attention of others? I mean, when you share your story, you find that people feel sorry for you and for what was done to you. That probably feels good. Maybe even, have you found that they're less critical of you because they say things like, well, wow, I mean, he's really had it rough, you know? I mean, this doesn't mean that you necessarily relish bad things that have come your way in your life, but has your story become a tool that perhaps you've learned to use, to even leverage with other people? Step 3 is just this. Would you reframe your narrative? Would you reframe your narrative? Would you be willing to reframe the way you're telling yourself the story? I mean, Joseph gives us a model of this. He didn't seem to choose to view his life through a victim mind trap. No, it seems that the story he was telling himself was that this is all part of a bigger plan, that I can trust in the one who is ultimately in control. I'm sure he had low moments, but it seemed like he was trusting in a God who was writing a bigger story through his life. I mean, his life, it displays the fact that God, he absolutely uses the hard times in our life. He uses the difficult season. He makes us stronger. I mean, if it weren't for the hard situations in life, we just wouldn't grow like God wants us to grow, because it's during the difficulty that that we actually find the resistance to fight against that creates the muscles inside of us that actually cause us to grow. What would it look like if you would choose to believe that maybe God is aligning the circumstances around you to do something in you and to do something through you? We can't always control our story, but we can always control our response. And that's a way to take the pen and put it in our hand and to reframe the narrative. Yeah, we can do this in a couple of different ways. I mean, you could pause to pray, and you could ask God to help you trust, even though you can't see his bigger plan. You could decide to say, you know what? I'm going to find something I'm grateful for. When I find myself caught up in the victim mind trap, I'm going to choose to be grateful for something now because it snaps me back into the present. It reminds me of the things and the people that I'm grateful for in my life right now. Another thing you could do is you could take a page from Joseph's story. You could actually choose to do something for someone else. Because when you do something for someone else, it actually gets you out of thinking only about yourself. It's a little gift that God gives us when we choose to think about someone else. And then here's one final thought to wrap up. Joseph was really a forerunner for someone who was to come later. He was really a forerunner for Jesus. I mean, think about it this way. Jesus himself, he was sold into slavery. I mean, what does that mean? Well, I mean, he became a human. He had all the power in the world, but he allowed himself to be constrained by humanity. Jesus was falsely accused. I mean, he went to the cross. He gave his life up on a cross that he didn't deserve. He was accused of things that he didn't do. And Jesus was forgotten about. And there's this moment in Jesus' life when he chose to give up his own life, where he took on becoming a victim. And as best as we can tell, he did it willingly so that you and I could experience victory. That's what having faith in Jesus is really all about. It's trusting that he did something for us, something that we cannot do on our own. And so this man that we know as the Apostle Paul, he wrote this a couple of dozen years after Jesus' life, after Jesus was resurrected from the dead. He said this, he said, "In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage, but rather he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness." Do you notice that Paul used the term mindset? He said, in your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus. And then he tells us what Jesus did, that Jesus did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. He took on the nature of a servant. He humbled himself. He showed his obedience to God's plan. Jesus became a victim for you. So why would you not choose to live in the victory that he provided? He not only pointed the way, but he made the way for us to get out. Freedom is so much better than being trapped. And God didn't design any of us to be held and captive by the victim mindset. And my prayer for you is that you would choose to experience the freedom that Jesus makes possible. We've created some questions to help you consider, maybe either on your own, what mindset adjustments you may need to make. Our suggestion would be that maybe you would even carve out some time this week to consider if you've been caught up by victim thinking. This mind map exercise will It will help you chart a way forward in establishing a new mindset. And our hope is that this resource will kickstart a process that leads to greater freedom for you, for your future.